It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. The kind of morning where fallen leaves danced across empty streets, and the air held that perfect mix of warmth and coolness. Officer James Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping his third coffee of the day, watching cars drift by on Cedar Street. 15 years on the force had made days like these feel routine, almost boring. But this particular Tuesday would be anything but ordinary. Through his rearview mirror, he noticed a silver Honda Civic approaching, driven by an elderly Asian woman. Something about her made him frown. Maybe it was the way she drove slightly under the speed limit, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Without any real reason, he flicked on his lights and pulled out behind her. The Honda pulled over perfectly, signaling and stopping in a safe spot away from the main traffic. Inside sat Diana Chen, a petite woman in her late 50s, dressed in a crisp blue blazer and wearing reading glasses that gave her a distinguished look. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit from decades of professional experience that Officer Reynolds wouldn't understand until much later. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, not even bothering with a greeting. His flashlight beam swept across her face unnecessarily, despite the morning sunlight being more than adequate. "Of course, officer," Diana replied calmly, her voice carrying years of quiet confidence. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for her documents with measured movements. Everything about her spelled professional, from her organized glove compartment to her perfectly valid documentation. Reynolds barely glanced at her papers. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his tone dripping with unnecessary authority. "No, officer, I don't," Diana responded, maintaining eye contact through her rearview mirror. "I was following all traffic regulations." "Well, you were driving quite suspiciously," he said, emphasizing the last word. "People like you need to understand that we take traffic safety very seriously in this neighborhood." Diana's expression didn't change, but she took careful mental notes of every word, every gesture. The dash cam was running, and she knew exactly how this interaction would look when reviewed by proper authorities. "Officer," she said politely, "could you please clarify what you mean by people like me and suspiciously? I was driving 5 miles under the speed limit due to the school zone ahead." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by her articulate response. Most people got nervous or angry when he spoke to them this way, but this woman remained surprisingly composed. It annoyed him even more. "Listen here," he said, scribbling on his ticket pad. "I'm writing you up for irregular driving patterns. Maybe next time you'll think twice about how you drive in this area." As he handed her the ticket, Diana accepted it with a slight nod, her eyes scanning the citation with the practiced ease of someone who had reviewed thousands of police documents. "Thank you, officer," she said simply. "Have a good day." Something about her calm demeanor unsettled Reynolds. He watched as she pulled away perfectly, using her turn signal and accelerating smoothly to the speed limit. For a brief moment, he felt a twinge of doubt about the ticket he'd just written, but he brushed it aside. Little did he know that this seemingly routine traffic stop would come back to completely transform his life and career. What Reynolds couldn't see was the slight smile that crossed Diana's face as she drove away. In her mind, she was already formulating plans, not for revenge, but for something far more important. Genuine, lasting change. She picked up her phone and made a quick call. "Yes, I'll accept the position. I think I can do some real good there." It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. The kind of morning where fallen leaves danced across empty streets, and the air held that perfect mix of warmth and coolness. Officer James Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping his third coffee of the day, watching cars drift by on Cedar Street. 15 years on the force had made days like these feel routine, almost boring. But this particular Tuesday would be anything but ordinary. Through his rearview mirror, he noticed a silver Honda Civic approaching, driven by an elderly Asian woman. Something about her made him frown. Maybe it was the way she drove slightly under the speed limit, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Without any real reason, He flicked on his lights and pulled out behind her. The Honda pulled over perfectly, signaling and stopping in a safe spot away from the main traffic. Inside sat Diana Chen, a petite woman in her late 50s, dressed in a crisp blue blazer and wearing reading glasses that gave her a distinguished look. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit from decades of professional experience that Officer Reynolds wouldn't understand until much later. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, not even bothering with a greeting. His flashlight beam swept across her face unnecessarily, despite the morning sunlight being more than adequate. "Of course, officer," Diana replied calmly, her voice carrying years of quiet confidence. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for her documents with measured movements. Everything about her spelled professional, from her organized glove compartment to her perfectly valid documentation. Reynolds barely glanced at her papers. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his tone dripping with unnecessary authority. "No, officer, I don't," Diana responded, maintaining eye contact through her rearview mirror. "I was following all traffic regulations." "Well, you were driving quite suspiciously," he said, emphasizing the last word. "People like you need to understand that we take traffic safety very seriously in this neighborhood." Diana's expression didn't change, but she took careful mental notes of every word, every gesture. The dash cam was running, and she knew exactly how this interaction would look when reviewed by proper authorities. "Officer," she said politely, "could you please clarify what you mean by people like me?" And suspiciously. "I was driving 5 miles under the speed limit due to the school zone ahead." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by her articulate response. Most people got nervous or angry when he spoke to them this way, but this woman remained surprisingly composed. It annoyed him even more. "Listen here," he said, scribbling on his ticket pad. "I'm writing you up for irregular driving patterns. Maybe next time you'll think twice about how you drive in this area." As he handed her the ticket, Diana accepted it with a slight nod, her eyes scanning the citation with the practiced ease of someone who had reviewed thousands of police documents. "Thank you, officer," she said simply. "Have a good day." Something about her calm demeanor unsettled Reynolds. He watched as she pulled away perfectly, using her turn signal and accelerating smoothly to the speed limit. For a brief moment, he felt a twinge of doubt about the ticket he'd just written, but he brushed it aside. Little did he know that this seemingly routine traffic stop would come back to completely transform his life and career. What Reynolds couldn't see was the slight smile that crossed Diana's face as she drove away. In her mind, she was already formulating plans, not for revenge, but for something far more important: genuine, lasting change. She picked up her phone and made a quick call. "Yes, I'll accept the position. I think I can do some real good there." 1 week after the traffic stop, Diana sat in her home office, surrounded by stacks of papers and multiple computer screens. She'd spent her career building cases, but this one felt different. It was personal, yet she approached it with the same careful precision she'd used in her biggest FBI investigations. The dash cam footage from her traffic stop played on one screen. She'd requested it through proper channels, and the department had no idea who she really was, just another citizen filing a routine records request. Every time she watched it, she noticed new details. Officer Reynolds' aggressive stance, his hand resting unnecessarily on his belt, the way his tone changed when he saw her face. On another screen, she reviewed Reynolds' traffic stop history for the past 3 years. The patterns were clear as day to her experienced eyes. Certain neighborhoods saw more stops. Certain faces received more tickets. The data told a story that statistics alone couldn't capture, the story of small daily injustices that added up to a much bigger problem. Diana took a sip of her cooling tea and opened her notebook. Her neat handwriting filled pages with observations and plans. She wasn't just documenting one incident. She was mapping out how to transform an entire department's culture. Her phone buzzed with a text from her old FBI partner. "Got those training materials you requested. Still fighting the good fight." She smiled, typing back a quick "always." Then she turned to her printer as it finished producing copies of Reynolds' stop records. Red sticky notes marked patterns that even the most skeptical reviewer couldn't ignore. But Diana wasn't interested in just pointing out problems. She was building a roadmap for solution. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as she reviewed the department's current training programs. They were outdated, focusing more on procedure than on community relations. She thought about how many officers, like Reynolds, probably saw themselves as protectors, but had lost sight of who they were really supposed to protect. A knock at her door interrupted her work. It was the delivery she'd been waiting for. Official copies of successful police reform programs from departments across the country. Diana had called in favors from old colleagues, gathering examples of real change that worked. She added these to her growing collection of evidence and solutions. Her cat jumped onto the desk, walking across her keyboard. Diana scratched behind his ears, remembering how she used to work late nights at the FBI, with this same cat keeping her company. "What do you think?" she asked him. "Ready to help make some changes in this town?" She pulled up the City Council's proposal for the new Office of Professional Standards and Reform. Their goals aligned perfectly with what she'd seen needed changing. But they'd left out key details. Details her years of experience told her were crucial for success. She opened a new document and began typing her own additions to the plan. As evening approached, Diana gathered everything into neat folders. This wasn't just about one officer or one traffic stop anymore. It was about creating lasting change. She'd seen too many reform attempts fail because they focused on punishment instead of transformation. Her approach would be different. She pinned up a new calendar on her wall, marking important dates. The department announcement would come soon, but she had work to do before then. Every step needed to be perfect, every detail accounted for. She'd learned long ago that real change required both patience and precision. Looking at the traffic ticket one last time, Diana placed it in a folder labeled Day 1. Soon, that ticket would become more than just a piece of paper. It would be the starting point of something much bigger. As she turned off her office lights, she felt that familiar excitement she used to get before a big case. But this time, she wasn't just solving a crime. She was rebuilding a system. The police department's main conference room buzzed with nervous energy that Monday morning. Officers filled every seat, their blue uniforms creating a sea of navy in the fluorescent light. Officer Reynolds sat near the back, sipping his coffee, barely paying attention. These department meetings usually meant more paperwork or new rules to follow. Chief Martinez stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat. "Today marks a new chapter for our department," he began, his voice carrying authority earned from 30 years of service. "As you all know, our city has faced challenges. Community trust isn't what it should be. That's why the City Council and I have created the Office of Professional Standards and Reform." Reynolds checked his phone under the table, half listening. Another reform program, he thought. They'd seen plenty of those come and go. But the chief's next words snapped his attention back to the front of the room. "Please welcome our new Director of Professional Standards, Diana Chen." The coffee cup nearly slipped from Reynolds' hand. There she was, the same woman he'd pulled over 2 weeks ago, now walking confidently to the podium in a professional Navy suit. His throat went dry as he remembered every word he'd said during that traffic stop. Diana took her place at the podium, her presence commanding the room despite her smaller stature. "Good morning, officers," she began, her voice warm but firm. "I spent 30 years in law enforcement, most recently leading the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. But I'm not here to police the police. I'm here to help us become the department this community deserves." Reynolds sank lower in his chair, his face burning. Around him, other officers leaned forward, interested in this newcomer who spoke with such quiet confidence. She wasn't what they'd expected. Not some angry reformer or disconnected bureaucrat, but someone who clearly understood their world. "I already reviewed our department statistics," Diana continued, clicking through slides that showed graphs and numbers. "I see both challenges and opportunities. More importantly, I see good officers who want to serve their community better." Her eyes swept the room, briefly meeting Reynolds' gaze. There was no anger there, no hint of revenge. Instead, he saw something that made him even more uncomfortable: understanding. "Starting next week, we'll begin new training programs," she explained, outlining plans that somehow managed to sound both ambitious and practical. "We'll also create a community advisory board, revise our traffic stop procedures, and implement a mentor system pairing senior officers with community leaders." The room stayed silent, but it wasn't the usual bored silence of department meetings. Officers were actually listening, some even taking notes. Diana's words painted a picture of change that felt possible, not just mandatory. "I've sat in these chairs," she said, gesturing to the audience. "I've worked tough beats, made split-second decisions, faced danger. I've also seen how small biases can grow into bigger problems. My door will always be open. Together, we can make this department a model for others to follow." As she stepped back from the podium, genuine applause broke out, not the polite kind, but real appreciation. Reynolds found his hands clapping too, though his mind was racing. What would happen now? Would she use that traffic stop against him? Chief Martinez wrapped up the meeting, but Reynolds barely heard him. He watched as several officers approached Diana, introducing themselves. She greeted each one warmly, remembering their names, asking about their roles. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. As the room emptied, Reynolds noticed a memo in his department mailbox. "Officer Reynolds, please schedule a meeting with my office this week. Director Chen." Simple, professional, no hint of what was to come. He folded the paper carefully, his coffee long forgotten. For the first time in his 15 years on the force, Officer Reynolds felt something he hadn't expected, not just fear of consequences, but a glimmer of something else. Maybe, just maybe, this change wouldn't be what he'd feared. The first month under Director Chen's leadership brought changes that rippled through the entire department. She worked quietly but effectively, reviewing cases and patterns with the careful eye of someone who'd spent decades understanding police work from the inside out. In her new office, Diana spread out dozens of reports across her desk. Traffic stop data from the past 5 years covered one wall, with colored pins marking patterns that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't just looking at Officer Reynolds anymore. His case had opened her eyes to a deeper issue within the department. "These numbers tell a story," she explained to Chief Martinez during their morning meeting. "Every dot on this map represents a traffic stop. Notice how they cluster in certain neighborhoods." She didn't need to spell it out. The pattern was clear enough. The chief leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "I had no idea it was this systematic," he admitted. "We've always gotten complaints, but seeing it laid out like this." Diana nodded, pulling out another set of files. "But here's the good news. We can fix this. Look at these success stories from other departments. Small changes in training and accountability made huge differences." As they talked, Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car across town, thinking about his upcoming meeting with the new director. He'd been watching her work from a distance, surprised by her approach. Instead of coming in with harsh changes, she'd spent time riding along with officers, listening to their concerns, understanding their daily challenges. Back in her office, Diana reviewed Reynolds' complete file. 15 years of service, multiple commendations, but also a troubling pattern of complaints that had been brushed aside. She saw something familiar in his record. Someone who'd started with good intentions but had lost his way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office as she prepared for their meeting. She wasn't planning to punish him. Her years of experience had taught her that shame and punishment rarely led to real change. Instead, she had something else in mind. A knock on her door announced Reynolds' arrival. He entered, still carrying himself with that forced confidence she'd seen during their first encounter. But now, there was uncertainty in his eyes. "Please, sit down." Diana gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what happened that morning, and more importantly, about what happens next." Reynolds sat stiffly, his uniform crisp but his expression tense. He watched as she pulled out the dash cam footage from their encounter, along with his traffic stop history. His heart raced, but her next words surprised him. "Officer Reynolds, I'm not here to end your career," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I'm here to help you become the kind of officer I know you can be. The kind this community needs." She spread out the data before him, not just his own stops, but the larger departmental patterns. "Look at these numbers. Really look at them. What do you see?" For the first time, Reynolds really looked, at the impact of his actions. The patterns were undeniable. Diana watched as understanding slowly dawned on his face. "I thought I was just doing my job," he said quietly, his usual defensiveness cracking. "I know," Diana replied. "That's exactly why we need to change not just individual actions, but the whole system. And I think you can help with that." Reynolds looked up, confused. "Help? How?" Diana smiled, pulling out a new folder. "I've been reviewing your early career records. Before these patterns started, you were known for community engagement, for building relationships. I'd like to help you find that officer again." As the afternoon light faded outside, they talked, really talked, about police work, about community, about change. For the first time in years, Reynolds felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the punishment he'd feared. It was something far more powerful, an opportunity to be part of real change. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Officer Reynolds walked in, wearing his uniform, but feeling strangely vulnerable. It was his first day of the new community engagement program Director Chen had designed, and he wasn't sure what to expect. The room was filled with local residents, shop owners, teachers, elderly folks, and young professionals. These were the same people he passed by countless times on patrol, but today was different. Today, he had to look them in the eyes and listen to their stories. "Welcome, everyone," Diana began, standing at the front of the room. "Today isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about building bridges." She caught Reynolds' eye and gave him an encouraging nod. She'd carefully planned this moment, knowing it could make or break her entire reform program. The first speaker was an elderly gentleman who owned the local grocery store. His hand shook slightly as he held the microphone, sharing his experience of being pulled over 3 times in 1 month. "Each time, I was just driving home from my store. Each time, no ticket, no reason. Just routine checks." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering similar stops he'd made. But now, seeing the pain in the old man's eyes, something began to change in his understanding. A young mother spoke next, describing how her children had become afraid of police cars. "They shouldn't fear the people who are supposed to protect them," she said, her voice steady but hurt. Reynolds thought about his own kids at home, trying to imagine them feeling scared of police officers. As more community members shared their experiences, Reynolds found himself taking notes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Each story added a piece to a puzzle he'd never fully seen before. During the break, he found himself standing by the coffee table next to the grocery store owner. After an awkward moment, Reynolds spoke up. "Sir, I'm sorry about what you've been through. It wasn't right." The old man looked surprised, then gave a small smile. "Thank you, officer. That means a lot." Diana watched this interaction from across the room, noting how Reynolds' usual defensive posture had softened. This was exactly what she'd hoped for. Not just policy changes, but heart changes. The afternoon session focused on solutions. Community members and officers worked in small groups, discussing how to improve police-community relations. Reynolds found himself actively participating, sharing insights from his 15 years on the force, while actually listening to residents' suggestions. "What if we had regular coffee meetings?" he suggested to his group. Once a month, officers could meet with community members, not for complaints, but just to talk. The idea was met with enthusiastic nods, and Reynolds felt something he hadn't experienced in years. the satisfaction of making a positive difference. As the session wrapped up, Diana called Reynolds to her office. He walked in, expecting criticism, but instead found her smiling. "You did well today," she said, pulling out a folder. "How would you feel about leading the coffee meeting program you suggested?" Reynolds blinked in surprise. "Me? But after everything?" "Sometimes," Diana interrupted gently, "the best person to lead change is someone who understands why it's needed. You've seen both sides now. That's valuable." Looking down at the proposal she'd already drafted, Reynolds felt a mix of emotions. Shame for his past actions, yes, but also hope. Hope that he could be part of making things better. "I won't lie to you," Diana continued. "It won't be easy. Some people will resist. Others won't trust you at first. But real change never is easy." Reynolds thought about the stories he'd heard today, about his own journey. "I want to help," he said finally. "I want to be part of the solution." Diana nodded, satisfied. This was more than just a mandatory training session or a punishment. This was the beginning of real transformation, starting with one officer who'd finally seen the light. 3 months into the new community program, Officer Reynolds stood in front of a fresh batch of police academy graduates. His uniform was the same, but everything else about him had changed, from his stance to the way he spoke. "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer," he began, his voice carrying across the training room. "I was wrong. Let me tell you a story about a traffic stop that changed my life." The young officers leaned forward, intrigued. This wasn't the usual dry training they'd expected. Reynolds shared his experience honestly, not hiding his mistakes or the prejudices that had clouded his judgment that day. In the back of the room, Diana watched quietly, a small smile playing on her lips. She'd seen this transformation happening gradually. Every community meeting, every coffee session, every honest conversation had added another piece to Reynolds' change. "Being a good officer isn't just about knowing the law or handling your weapon," Reynolds continued. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person you meet." He clicked to the next slide, showing pictures from recent community events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, having coffee with elderly residents, helping at the neighborhood cleanup day. One of the new recruits raised her hand. "But how do you stay safe while being approachable? Isn't it dangerous to let your guard down?" Reynolds nodded, appreciating the question. "That's exactly what I used to think. But here's what I learned. Treating people with respect doesn't make you more vulnerable. It makes you more effective." He pulled up the department's recent statistics. Crime rates hadn't gone up with the new approach. They'd actually decreased in areas where community engagement was strongest. Tips from residents had increased by 60%, helping solve several long-standing cases. During the lunch break, Diana found Reynolds in the break room, going over his notes for the afternoon session. "You've come a long way," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Reynolds looked up, remembering their first real meeting in her office. "I keep thinking about that traffic stop," he admitted. "How differently it would have gone if I'd been the officer I am now." Diana sat down across from him. "That's exactly why your story is so powerful. You're not just teaching procedures. You're showing them that change is possible." The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Reynolds had the new officers role-play different situations, but with a twist. After each scene, he had them switch roles, letting them feel both sides of each interaction. "Remember," he told them, "every person you meet has a story. Your job isn't just to enforce the law. It's to protect and serve everyone in our community." After the training, Reynolds headed to the local coffee shop for his weekly community meetup. These sessions, once awkward and tense, had become something he looked forward to. Today, the grocery store owner from his first community meeting was there, now a regular attendee. "Officer Reynolds," the old man called out, waving him over. "Come meet my grandson. He wants to be a police officer too." As Reynolds sat down with them, sharing stories and advice with the eager young man, he caught his reflection in the window. His badge still shined on his chest, But it meant something different now. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of responsibility, of the trust he was working to rebuild. Back at the station, Diana reviewed the feedback forms from the training session. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, with many recruits specifically mentioning how Reynolds' personal story had impacted them. She pinned another success story to her office wall, a newspaper article about the department's improving community relations. Reynolds' quote stood out: "Sometimes the biggest changes start with admitting our mistakes and being willing to learn from them." The sun was setting as Reynolds finished his shift, casting long shadows across the station parking lot. A year ago, he would have seen only potential threats in the gathering darkness. Now he saw his community: people heading home from work, kids playing in yards, families walking dogs. And he felt something that had been missing for years: pride in his true purpose as an officer of the law. The City Hall auditorium was packed for the annual Police Department Community Forum. Colorful posters made by local schoolchildren decorated the walls, each one showing police officers helping people, playing with kids, and keeping the community safe. At the back of the stage, a banner read, "Building Trust Together." 1 year later, Officer Reynolds adjusted his tie nervously backstage. In just a few minutes, he would face the largest crowd of his career. Not to make arrests or maintain order, but to share his story of transformation. Director Chen appeared beside him, straightening his name tag. "Ready?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd watched him prepare for this moment for weeks. "You know," Reynolds said quietly, "a year ago, I would have called this whole thing a waste of time. Funny how things change." He peeked through the curtain at the diverse crowd filling every seat. The forum began with Chief Martinez presenting the year's statistics. Crime rates down, community participation up, officer satisfaction improved. But numbers only told part of the story. The real changes were in the stories people shared. An elderly woman spoke about how officers now regularly checked on seniors living alone. A teenager described a basketball league where kids played weekly games with police officers. The grocery store owner, now a regular at community meetings, talked about how his business had grown since officers started doing weekly walkthroughs, greeting customers, and building relationships. Then it was Reynolds' turn. As he walked to the podium, he saw familiar faces in the crowd, people who'd gone from being suspicious of him to becoming partners in community safety. He took a deep breath and began. "1 year ago, I made a traffic stop that changed everything," he started, his voice steady. "I pulled over someone because of my own prejudices, not because of any real violation. That someone turned out to be our new director of professional standards." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Some knew this story, but many were hearing it for the first time. But Director Chen didn't respond with anger or revenge. Reynolds continued. "Instead, she showed me something I'd forgotten. That true police work is about protecting and serving everyone, not just some people." He shared stories from the past year. The coffee meetings that went from awkward to meaningful, the community programs that transformed relationships, the changes he'd seen in himself and his fellow officers. "I stand before you today, not just to apologize for my past actions," he said, his voice growing stronger, "but to make a commitment to our future. Every day, I work to be the kind of officer this community deserves." From her seat in the front row, Diana watched as Reynolds connected with the audience. His words weren't rehearsed or artificial. They came from real experience, real change. The most powerful moment came when a young girl raised her hand during the question period. "Officer Reynolds," she asked, "were you scared to change?" Reynolds smiled, kneeling down to her level. "Yes, I was. Change is always scary. But you know what's scarier? Staying the same when you know you need to be better." After the forum, people lingered in the hallway, sharing stories and snacks. Reynolds found himself surrounded by community members, not with complaints but with ideas for new programs, suggestions for improvement, and words of appreciation. Diana watched from across the room as Reynolds showed a group of kids his police badge. explaining how it represented a promise to protect everyone in the community. The kids' eyes sparkled with admiration, not fear. Later, as they cleaned up the auditorium, Reynolds helped Diana take down the children's posters. "You know," he said, carefully rolling up a drawing of a police officer helping an elderly person cross the street. "I never thought I'd say this, but that traffic stop was the best thing that could have happened to me." Diana smiled, remembering the angry officer from a year ago. "Sometimes," she replied, "our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest growth, if we're willing to learn from them." As they walked out into the evening air, police cars and family vehicles sharing the parking lot peacefully, both knew that while their work wasn't finished, they'd helped create something special, a model of what police-community relations could be. 18 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department's break room was buzzing with excitement. News crews set up their equipment outside, and officers hurried to straighten their uniforms. Today was special. Their department had been chosen as a national model for police reform. Officer Reynolds stood by the window, watching more cars pull into the parking lot. State officials, police chiefs from other cities, and community leaders were all coming to learn about their success. His hand touched the envelope in his pocket. Inside was a special award he'd be receiving today, but that wasn't what made him most proud. Director Chen appeared beside him, now a familiar and respected presence in the department. "Nervous?" she asked, though they both knew he'd come too far for that. "Just thinking," he replied, watching families stream into the building. "Remember when we used to have empty chairs at community meetings? Now we need extra seats." The ceremony began in the packed auditorium. Chief Martinez spoke first, sharing impressive statistics. Complaints down by 70%, community trust up by 85%, crime rates at a 10-year low. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. A local teacher spoke about how her students no longer ducked down when police cars passed by. The grocery store owner, now head of the Community Advisory Board, described how business had improved since officers became regular, friendly faces in local shops. Then came the surprise that brought tears to many eyes. A group of elderly residents, led by the very woman Reynolds had stopped that day 18 months ago, announced a scholarship fund. It would help local youth attend the police academy, with a focus on building a force that truly represented their community. When Reynolds stood to receive his award for outstanding community policing, he almost couldn't speak. Looking out at the crowd, he saw not strangers or potential threats, but neighbors, friends, and partners in keeping their community safe. "This award," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "doesn't belong just to me. It belongs to every person in this room." He turned to Diana. "It belongs to someone who saw potential for change when she could have sought revenge, who taught me that true strength comes from admitting mistakes and working to fix them." He shared stories that brought both laughter and tears. The first time he played basketball with local kids and got thoroughly beaten, the coffee meetings that turned into friendship gatherings, the day a former critic asked him to speak at her son's school career day. "But my proudest moment," he continued, "wasn't receiving any award. It was last week, when a rookie officer asked me how to handle a difficult situation. Instead of reaching for his ticket book, he asked me how to build trust first. That's when I knew. Real change isn't just about policies. It's about changing hearts." After the ceremony, as people mingled over refreshments, Reynolds found himself standing with Diana near the display of community photos. "You know what," he said, "I never properly thank you." Diana smiled, watching a group of young officers chatting easily with community members. "You've thanked me every day for 18 months, she replied. "Every positive interaction, every life you've touched, every officer you've mentored, that's your thank you." As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow through the windows, the station buzzed with plans for the future. New programs were being discussed, more departments wanted to learn their methods, and the next generation of officers was already showing interest in their approach. Reynolds walked to his car that evening, passing families heading home from the ceremony. A little girl waved at him. the daughter of the woman who'd once filed a complaint against him. Now she wanted to be a police officer when she grew up. The ticket book in his patrol car had gathered dust, replaced by something more powerful: understanding, respect, and genuine care for his community. As he started his evening patrol, he didn't just see streets to monitor or laws to enforce. He saw his extended family, a community that had taught him as much as he'd ever taught them. And somewhere in Director Chen's office, framed on the wall, hung an old traffic ticket, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, and that it's never too late to become the person you're meant to be.